Hello again, everyone. My apologies again about the terrible audio quality this week. I'm actually going to start here on the cognitive behavioral therapy slide. I think you could hear the first 5 or 6 minutes of the last lecture okay. And I am just really pressed for time, so I'm going to skip our intro and our review and jump right into cognitive behavioral therapy so that you can catch the important parts of this lecture. So, what is CBT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not a therapy like a single therapy in and of itself. It's actually a combination of similar interventions that we use to help students manage their behaviors. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to these as self-management or independently regulated sorts of procedures that students can use to manage their own behavior. And there are three primary assumptions of CBT. The first is that our thoughts and our beliefs impact our behaviors. So if we think about something in a particular way and we believe something, will happen or will or won't happen, then that really impacts what actually happens and how we behave. The second assumption is that changes in how we think and how we believe can lead to changes in our behaviors. So it's really, builds off of that first assumption. And then finally, the third piece is that everyone is an active participant in our own learning. So we all play a role in how we learn. So you can see how those all work together. It's also important to know that cognitive behavioral therapy is based on the principles of ABA. And I think for those of you who are a little more skeptical of ABA, you'll realize that there are some similarities in terms of how we deliver behavioral supports or even how students deliver their own behavioral supports or interventions. And I think most times people feel a little more comfortable with cognitive behavioral therapies because they don't seem quite as intrusive, but they definitely still are derived from applied behavior analysis. So it's nice to kind of see how you can embed applied behavior analysis in behavioral interventions that are not, ethically unsound or super intrusive or, not responsive to the needs of different learners. So some important things to know there about cognitive behavioral therapy. And you also want to think about how they are useful. So, research has shown that cognitive behavioral interventions can be useful for changing behaviors, particularly for shaping maladaptive behaviors in special education settings. We know that there's less dependence on teachers or external control because students can, provide their own reinforcement. They're engaging in self-talk. They are playing a major role in their behavior management. And so having this self-management piece means that they're more proactive, right? So we're taking care of the possibility of a behavior occurring by being proactive about it, by identifying what the signs and symptoms are and avoiding those spaces and places and triggers. So this really helps to prevent problem behaviors. CBIs also have autonomy built in because students can manage their own behaviors and they're not relying on someone else to manage them for them. And then finally, there's more generalization because the behaviors are not always controlled by a teacher's reinforcement. So, for example, if you have a student in a behavioral classroom who's really struggling with containing his or her outbursts, anger outburst, but he's engaged in a cognitive behavioral intervention where he or she provides their own reinforcement, it's easier to translate that from a home environment to the school bus, to the classroom, to the cafeteria, and back to home because you have the consistency of providing your own reinforcement and you're not relying on a teacher, right? So if your teacher is always providing your reinforcement and then you run into a situation on the bus, well, the teacher's not there to provide the reinforcement. So do you think a student would be as inclined to, engage in their behavior management strategies, right? Probably not. So keep that in mind as you think more about the impact of curriculum-based instruction. The next slide is about self-management interventions, and the first one is self-monitoring. So when students self-monitor, they essentially have to observe and record the frequency of their own behavior. And there are some prerequisite skills that are required before students can do this. The first is that they have to be aware of their behavior. So they have to know that, punching their peer is A, not okay, and B, that it's happening, right? They have to be aware that they're doing that. And they also have to be able to record the behavior. So they have to have the cognitive and functional skills to be able to actually record the behavior. We know that self-monitoring actually improves social behaviors and academic performance. So it can be very helpful in both behavioral and academic contexts. And again, students need to have some prerequisites for engaging in this self-monitoring. And the first is they need to know how to actually record the data. So one example of that might be event recording, where they record the frequency, or they might be recording how often something happens within a particular amount of time. And we refer to that as time sampling. So you have to teach them how to use the intervention. Here's a quick video where you can look at a self-monitoring sheet and how it's used. And then there's another video, I think we might have watched this early in the semester, but it's great. It's worth watching again, where you can see how the students are actually using the self-monitoring within the context of the classroom. You can see how they reward themselves and everything. So these are great to watch to get a better look at self-monitoring. So after you watch the videos, please take a moment to reflect on these questions, and then we will keep going. Self-management interventions. So self-evaluation is a self-management intervention. And when you use self-evaluation, students are comparing their own behavior to a standard that has already been set. So you might set your standard as, if in your classroom you say, all right, Jonathan, you need to earn 12 points to, get your reinforcer. That's sort of a set standard that you have, okay? And the first step for evaluating oneself is that the student knows how to self-monitor and they know what to do. And the teacher has already set the criterion for what that will be. And then in many cases, we use rating scales. So it might be a scale that says 1 to 5, 1 being I did a lousy job of, following directions, and 5 being I did a great job following directions. And so the rating skills are usually really effective, especially for students who are either in elementary school or may struggle more with more cognitive deficits. And so a rating scale is pretty accessible for most learners. Another component of self-evaluation is that students need the teacher to provide some feedback about their performance. So the student engages in this self-evaluation, but as you can see in the example here, the teacher either agrees or disagrees with this. And this example has it set up so that if the teacher agrees with the student's self-evaluation, then they can earn bonus points. So you can see how that might be effective in helping students become a little more in tune to what they are actually doing, because our perceptions are often different from those of the people around us. Self-reinforcement is another example of a self-management intervention, and self-reinforcement is exactly what it says. It's different from traditional reinforcement because you deliver it yourself. And there's one critical piece about it, and it's that it needs to be delivered consistently and systematically. So you want to make sure that, self-reinforcement is provided at designed intervals, at predetermined intervals, and, consistently and systematically. So at whatever point in time, under whatever circumstances it should be provided, is when it should happen. So to teach self-reinforcement, again, students have to be able to monitor and evaluate their own behavior. If they aren't able to do this, if they aren't able to achieve these steps, then it'll be really hard to teach the self-reinforcement strategy. And then you also want to be able to decide on internal or external reinforcement. So you can choose on whether it'll be an external reinforcer from another adult or the teacher in the classroom, or whether the reinforcement will be sort of internal in that it is, like, for example, sometimes moving the color, if you're in an elementary classroom and your student is moving their chip or their stick or whatever they use for their color system to green, sometimes that in and of itself is reinforcement, and you don't necessarily need something else. So you just have to think about what level of reinforcement will be used, and then you have to, of course, set the criteria for reinforcement so that everyone is on the same page. So this is our break slide, but of course this is kind of a much quicker version of this presentation for this week. So we're going to keep cranking through. Obviously, if you need to take a break whenever you need to, absolutely do so. We're moving on to verbal mediation-based interventions. And these, the first example of a verbal mediation-based intervention is self-instructional training. And with self-instructional training, students often use verbal prompts to guide their behavior. So it might be it's a verbal prompt most often, but for students who struggle with cognitive or communication challenges, it could literally be a written prompt that's taped to their desk. But most often they're verbally prompting themselves to guide behavior. So it might be like saying to oneself, this might be a hard situation, but I know what to do, right? Or I know this makes me feel angry, but I have strategies to calm down, okay? And there are a number of coping strategies, and there are a number of ways that students can engage in using instructional training, both for academic challenges and behavior problems. So academically, you could have students who literally walk themselves through a multiplication problem, right? And they verbally kind of talk aloud to be able to self-instruct and be able to complete their task. Another form of a verbal mediation-based intervention is called alternate response training. And in this situation, students essentially are taught alternative responses. So it's basically teaching a replacement behavior. So again, you have to be able to monitor your own behavior, and then you have to be able to engage in the replacement behavior. So if a student has not yet learned the replacement behavior, or they're not able to consistently engage in using that replacement behavior, it becomes really difficult to use this training protocol. But if they are able to do that, it's very effective, and it's essentially using a replacement behavior the way that we think about our behavior intervention plans. And so it's an ideal strategy and an ideal step in eliminating or reducing the problem behaviors that you might see. So this alternate response training does require external reinforcement from the teacher or from another adult in the classroom. The next slide talks about problem-solving training, and again, this is another really great strategy to use, especially for students with severe emotional disturbance. It's a great way to be able to reduce problem behavior and aggressive behaviors in students in your classrooms, and this strategy is important for self-instruction and for students to be able to recognize that a problem exists. And so that's really the first step in using this intervention or using this particular strategy. Students have to recognize that, punching their peer or cursing at their teacher or whatever the maladaptive behavior is, they have to recognize that the problem exists. And then they have to be able to define the problem, right? So you want to work on developing an operational definition that's clear and specific, right, and measurable. You also want to be able to generate solutions. So, okay, we've identified this problem. We know what it is. What are some solutions to this problem? And how can we evaluate those solutions, right? So, what might be an alternative to kicking or cursing? Like, how do we solve this problem? What's causing the behavior, and how can we solve that issue? You also want to implement a plan and then monitor the solution. So this problem solving really embeds a lot of the principles that are a part of a functional based, a FBA, sorry, functional behavior assessment. I'm forgetting my words today. So here we have a look at a problem-solving curriculum. This is a nice example that you can take a quick look at to get become a bit more familiar with how problem-solving curricula are used within the school setting. Anger control training is another verbal mediation-based intervention. And with anger control training, we aim to teach students how to control their anger through their own self-instructions. So they might use some verbal prompts like, there won't be a need to argue because I know what to do, or I know how to handle this situation. So you really have to use some coping skills that are proactive to be able to, they might in some cases be proactive, but sometimes it might be in the heat of the moment. So if they're preparing for provocation, then it'll be in advance. If they've already become aroused and someone sort of triggered them or something has already triggered them, then they have to remember to use their coping skills. Time to take a deep breath, go for a walk, tap on my knees, whatever it is that they use to cope. They talk themselves through that. And then finally, students can reflect on resolved conflicts using their anger control training. So you can say, you know what, I got through that the last time and everything was okay. Or I got through that and I didn't get angry, so I know I can do it again. And so these are the verbal reminders and the verbal prompts that students can use to work on successfully managing their anger. Another component of cognitive behavioral interventions are the rational emotive behavioral therapies. And the premise behind the REBT, it's one therapy really, is that emotional and behavioral challenges are a result of how we think about them. So we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of this lecture. And it's really critical to understand that there is a combination of both cognitive, emotive or emotional, and behavioral therapies that together help us manage our bodies and our behaviors, right? And so the REBT is designed to help both the students and the teachers be able to manage challenging behaviors. And there are 3 underlying assumptions of this particular approach. The first is to understand that students are the sum total of their experiences. So whatever it is that they experience contributes to who they are as a person. So we have to understand that. Secondly, we need to understand that students are responsible for their own emotions and actions, right? So, sometimes for students with disabilities, we kind of, decide that, maybe they can't control their emotions or their actions. And that's quite possibly true, but they're still responsible for them, right? So we have to acknowledge that. And then the third piece is to know that harmful emotions and challenging behaviors are results of irrational thinking. Sometimes our thinking has such a negative impact on our behavior that it results in both harmful emotions and or behaviors. So in order to implement CBIs, we need to first conduct the functional assessment. We second need to work on planning a program, so that would be your BIP. And you want to choose a particular procedure. You want to make sure your student knows how to use it. So nothing will benefit you in a cognitive behavioral intervention if your students don't know how to use their intervention, right? These are supposed to, in most cases, be student-driven strategies. So you want to make sure that the students understand and know how to use them. You also want to be able to implement the interventions with fidelity. So whether that means data collection, or the reinforcement piece, you want to make sure that every step of the strategy or every step of the intervention is clear, both for you and for your students, so that everyone is on the same page and everyone is implementing them as designed. And then finally, you want to be able to generalize or carry over into different settings what you have learned or what your students have learned in terms of managing their behaviors within different spaces. So, for example, if a student is able to manage his or her anger at school, you want him or her to be able to do that on the bus and at home and in the cafeteria and on the playground, right? And so you want to teach them how to use those same strategies to manage that behavior in different settings and under different conditions. So they might be provoked in different ways or by different people, and you want to teach them how to cope with that provocation. So we have another IRIS module that's available, and it focuses on helping students to become independent learners. Again, this is optional. It's not a required assignment this week. I think the IRIS modules are really great because they're developed by, people who have worked in the field, former teachers, other professionals in special education at Vanderbilt, and I actually worked on a team where we helped with designing in one of the modules. So, anyways, they're really great resources to use, and I encourage you to use it as much or as little as you need. If you would like more information and a little more background around curriculum-based instruction. Sorry, I knew I was going to say that. Cognitive behavioral interventions, the CBIs, I do it every time. If you want a little more information around cognitive behavioral interventions and how to support students in becoming more independent learners, feel free to take some time to explore this module, the IRIS Center module. And if you feel like you have a good grasp and a good handle on it, then just know that it's a resource that's available.